Welcome to our sleepy exploration of how the Roman Empire grew so vast, a story of systems, not just soldiers. Now is the time to get comfortable. Settle into your favorite chair or pull the blankets up just a little closer to your chin. Allow your shoulders to drop and take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it late in the evening for you? Or are you perhaps stealing a quiet moment from a wonderfully jumbled schedule? Whatever the hour, I am so glad you have found this time to rest. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, a gentle tap on the subscribe button ensures you will not miss our next one. And now, let your mind drift. We journey back not to a throne room or a famous battle, but to the methodical processes behind the empire's growth. We will explore the quiet, relentless work of the engineers and administrators, the architects of an empire built on roads, logistics, and unbreakable supply lines that allowed travelers to move with purpose across huge distances. The story of Rome's great expansion does not begin in a city of marble, but on the rough, broken ground of central Italy during the 4th century before the Common Era. Here, a young republic was surrounded by determined rivals. The Etruscans to the north, fierce Gallic tribes filtering down from the mountains, and most formidably, the tough Samnite warriors of the Apennine hills. Most armies of this period fought in a formation known as the phalanx, a dense wall of men and spears that was immensely powerful when moving over flat, open ground. But the Italian peninsula was not flat. A solid wall of spears would quickly break apart on the rolling hills and in the dense forests, creating deadly gaps. For Rome to survive, let alone to grow, it needed a better way to fight. In response to this challenge, the Romans developed a new military system, one that turned the very terrain from an enemy into an ally. Instead of a single, solid block of soldiers, they arranged their legions in a checkerboard pattern. This formation was made of 3 distinct lines of small, flexible units called maniples. This structure meant that the army was not a rigid spear, but something more like a net, able to bend and flow over uneven ground without breaking its cohesion. When observers first saw this army on the march, it looked less like a unified force and more like a collection of separate, smaller groups moving in concert. This visual difference hinted at a profound operational advantage that would soon become clear to Rome's many opponents. The first line to meet the enemy was composed of the hastati, the youngest and most eager men, typically in their late teens or early 20s. They were not career soldiers, but citizen farmers fulfilling their civic duty. Each man carried the heavy wooden shield, the scutum, its curved shape designed to deflect blows and protect the body from shoulder to knee. Before closing with the enemy, they would hurl a pair of light spears, then draw their primary weapon. This was the short, stabbing sword known as the gladius, a brutally effective tool made of locally sourced iron. Their protection was simple: a bronze helmet and perhaps a small bronze plate over the heart, with the rest of their defense relying entirely on their large shield and the man standing next to them. The genius of this equipment was in its practical application. The large scutum was not merely a passive piece of armor, it was an active weapon. A soldier would punch forward with the shield's heavy central boss, knocking an opponent off balance and creating an opening. In that brief moment, the gladius came into play. Unlike the long, slashing swords used by many of their enemies, the gladius was designed for a quick, lethal thrust in the tight, pressing confusion of close-quarters battle. This combination of shield punch and sword thrust, repeated by thousands of disciplined men, created a relentless and terrifying offensive pressure that could shatter an enemy's battle line. It was a system that valued practical results over elegant flourishes.
The true innovation, however, was in how these lines worked together. After the initial clash, as the hastati began to tire, a signal would be given. These frontline troops would then perform a difficult maneuver, conducting a fighting withdrawal. They would fall back through the deliberate gaps left in the second line behind them. This second line was made up of the principes, men in the prime of their lives, from their late 20s to their 30s. They were more experienced and better equipped. As the weary hastati found space to rest and regroup, the fresh principes would step forward, presenting the enemy with a solid new wall of shields and a fresh wave of determined fighters. This process could wear down even the most ferocious enemy assault. Should the battle still hang in the balance after the principes were fully engaged, the Romans had one final decisive asset. Kneeling in reserve at the very back were the triarii, the oldest and most hardened veterans of the legion. They were armed not with throwing spears, but with long thrusting spears, forming a last-ditch phalanx of their own. There was a saying in Rome for a desperate situation: "It has come to the triarii." This meant that all other options had been exhausted. When these grizzled veterans stood up and leveled their spears, it was the final, unbreakable anchor of the Roman line, a sight that often caused wavering enemies to lose heart and break completely. This layered defense gave the legion incredible resilience. This effective military organization was a direct reflection of the society that created it. The army was composed of property-owning citizens, men who had a stake in the republic they were defending. Labor was organized not by birth, but by experience and proven courage on the battlefield. The core unit, the maniple of 120 men, was commanded by a centurion. This was an officer who rose from the ranks, selected for his leadership and bravery, not his family name. He commanded the absolute loyalty of his men because he fought alongside them, sharing their risks and hardships. This merit-based system of leadership ensured that the maniples were commanded by the most capable individuals, fostering a powerful bond within the ranks.
Historical accounts and archaeological findings have sparked a long-running discussion among scholars. Was this brilliant manipular system a purely Roman invention, or was it an adaptation of tactics used by their enemies? Some sources suggest that the Romans learned hard lessons from fighting the Samnites, who used smaller, more flexible formations in their native mountain terrain. It is possible that the Romans, always practical, adopted and perfected the tactics of their most difficult opponents. Others argue that while they may have been influenced by their rivals, the systematic three-line structure and the disciplined rotation of troops were uniquely Roman developments, a testament to their particular genius for organization. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Regardless of its precise origins, this military engine allowed Rome to achieve what no one thought possible: the unification of the Italian peninsula. The manipular legion's flexibility gave it a decisive advantage over the rigid phalanxes of the Etruscans and the wild, disorganized charges of the Gauls. On the broken terrain where other armies faltered, the Roman legion thrived. Over generations of near-constant warfare, it systematically defeated every one of its neighbors, slowly but surely extending its control from the city of Rome outwards. This conquest was not just a military victory. It established a cultural mindset of relentless adaptation that would serve Rome for centuries. The manipular legion was, therefore, much more than a way of fighting. It was a system that bound military structure, social organization, and practical technology together into a single conquering force. The citizen farmer, the centurion who earned his rank, the simple but effective equipment, and the flexible battlefield tactics all combined to create an army perfectly suited to its environment. This was the tool that carved out Rome's initial dominance and laid the groundwork for the vast empire that was to follow. These foundational methods of organization and adaptation established a pattern that would define their approach to challenges for centuries to come.
The flexible legionary blade had secured the fields and valleys of Italy. But beyond the peninsula, a different kind of challenge awaited. The world was full of high walls, ancient fortresses built of stone and stubborn pride. An open field battle, however skillfully won, could not breach these defenses. Victory in this new, wider world demanded a different kind of thinking, a different set of tools, and a discipline that went far beyond the sword and shield. It required the legions to become not just soldiers, but architects of destruction, masters of a slow, grinding, and inexorable science. The clash of armies gave way to the steady, rhythmic sounds of industry, the sharp ring of hammers striking iron, the grating rasp of saws cutting through massive timbers, and the low, careful voices of engineers making their calculations. This methodical approach to warfare began with containment. Before a single stone could be thrown, the target city had to be completely isolated from the outside world. Thousands of legionaries, their swords sheathed and their shields set aside, took up shovels and picks. Under the watchful eyes of their centurions, they dug. They excavated a massive trench, sometimes miles in circumference, that encircled the entire fortress. The earth from this trench was then used to build a corresponding wall, often studded with watchtowers and forts at regular intervals. This was the circumvallation, a line of fortification facing inward, designed to keep the defenders from escaping or launching surprise attacks. Historical accounts describe how, in some cases, a second outer wall was also built, facing away from the city, to protect the Romans from any relief army that might arrive. This systematic encirclement was the first act of psychological pressure, a clear message to those within the walls that there would be no escape and no rescue. With the city sealed off, the true engineering work could commence. The legion had within its ranks a specialized corps of engineers and craftsmen known as the fabri. These men were masters of wood, iron, and physics, and they oversaw the transformation of ordinary soldiers into a highly organized construction workforce. The surrounding forests were soon felled, the vast quantities of timber dragged back to the Roman camp. There, under the direction of the fabri, the wood was measured, cut, and joined. The sounds of construction were constant, as men worked in shifts day and night. A centurion acted less as a combat commander and more as a project foreman, shouting orders, checking measurements, and ensuring the precise assembly of the giant machines that would bring down the city's walls. This transformation of a fighting force into a factory of war was a distinctively Roman trait. From this organized labor, towering structures began to rise. Siege towers, some reaching higher than the city walls themselves, were assembled piece by piece on site. These were not crude ladders, but mobile fortresses, built with heavy wooden frames and multiple levels. The lowest level might house a battering ram, while the middle levels would be packed with soldiers ready to storm the ramparts. And the top level would provide a platform for archers to fire down upon the defenders. To protect these valuable wooden structures from fire arrows and burning pitch that would inevitably rain down, they were covered in layers of wet animal hides or turf soaked in water. This use of fire-retardant materials was a crucial innovation, born from bitter experience, that allowed the relentless Roman advance to continue even under heavy fire. While the towers crept forward, other teams of legionaries worked on different kinds of machines. The ground would tremble with the operation of the onager, a powerful catapult named after the wild donkey because of its powerful kick. This machine used a single thick bundle of twisted animal sinew as a torsion spring. A long wooden arm was forced down against the tension of this spring, and a large stone or clay pot filled with flammable material was placed in a sling at its end. When released, the arm would fly upward with tremendous force, launching its payload in a high arc to crash down inside the city, destroying buildings and crushing morale. The constant tension and release, the groaning of the wood, and the sharp crack of the launch became a familiar and terrifying sound for the besieged. For more direct, precise attacks against the walls and enemy soldiers, the Romans deployed the ballista. This was essentially a giant crossbow, far too large for one person to handle. It also used torsion springs made of tightly wound sinew, but it had two, one for each arm of the bow. A winch system was used to draw back the thick bowstring, and once a heavy iron-tipped bolt, sometimes several feet long, was loaded, it could be fired with incredible accuracy and force. These bolts could punch through wooden barricades and skewer multiple defenders at once. The careful process of aiming and firing, guided by a skilled artilleryman, turned the ballista into a sniper's weapon on a massive scale, capable of picking off key targets on the battlements and clearing the way for the larger siege engines to advance. The core challenge, of course, was overcoming the sheer physical barrier of a well-built stone wall while under constant attack. The Roman solution was never a single desperate gamble, but a multi-pronged, systematic application of overwhelming force. While artillery, like the onager and ballista, suppressed the defenders, the great siege towers were slowly rolled forward on wheels or logs, often over a ramp built of earth and timber that gradually rose to the height of the walls. At the same time, soldiers protected by mobile sheds called tortoises would work at the base of the wall with battering rams, huge iron-tipped logs suspended from a frame that could be swung back and forth to pulverize stone and splinter gates. The combination of these attacks, happening all at once from different directions, was designed to exhaust and overwhelm the city's defenders. This methodical application of engineering was profoundly demoralizing. For the people trapped inside the city, the experience was one of growing dread. The world shrank to the circle of Roman walls around them. Every day, the hammering and sawing from the enemy camp was a reminder of the closing net. They would watch the siege towers grow taller, the ramps get closer, and the catapults land with ever-increasing accuracy. The Romans were not just attacking their walls, they were dismantling their hope, piece by piece. Historical accounts often note that cities would surrender not when their walls were finally breached, but long before, broken by the psychological strain of facing an enemy that seemed as patient and powerful as a force of nature.
Of course, maintaining such a massive, stationary army for months or even years required a logistical system as sophisticated as the siege engines themselves. The same discipline that organized the construction crews also organized the supply lines. A steady stream of wagons and pack animals would arrive at the camp, bringing grain, tools, and replacement parts from across the Roman territories. Granaries were built within the camp, their floors raised on posts to allow air to circulate and keep the grain from rotting. The ability to feed, equip, and sustain a besieging army indefinitely was another weapon in the Roman arsenal. It meant they could outlast any city, simply waiting until starvation forced a surrender if the engineering assault was not enough. This mastery of siegecraft made the Roman army seem unstoppable. It fundamentally changed the political calculus for Rome's opponents. No fortress was truly safe. No wall was too high. The knowledge that resisting Rome would not lead to a noble defense, but to total encirclement and inevitable destruction, became a powerful diplomatic tool. Many cities and kingdoms, when faced with the approach of the legions, chose to negotiate a surrender rather than face the unbreakable fist of Roman engineering. This technical superiority, therefore, was a key engine of expansion, allowing Rome to absorb new territories with a minimum of costly open warfare. The threat of the siege was often enough to achieve the desired result. Scholars have long debated the origins of this advanced military technology. Some of the basic principles, especially concerning catapults, were clearly inherited from the engineers of the Hellenistic Greek kingdoms that came before Rome. Records suggest that Roman commanders studied Greek technical manuals. However, the Romans were not mere imitators. They refined these designs, standardized their parts for mass production, and, most importantly, integrated them into a systematic doctrine of siege warfare that was uniquely their own. Archaeological evidence from siege sites across Europe, like Alasia in Gaul, shows a scale of earthworks and a level of organization that far surpassed what had come before. It was the Roman genius for practical application and disciplined organization that turned existing ideas into an unstoppable force.
The legionary, therefore, became more than a soldier. He was a digger of ditches, a feller of trees, a carpenter, a stonemason, and a mechanic. His service was not just a series of battles, but long periods of hard physical labor. This constant work kept the army disciplined and fit during the long, often tedious months of a siege. It built a sense of collective effort where every soldier played a part in the grand mechanical process of conquest. The centurion, overseeing his men as they built a ramp or assembled a ballista, was shaping the very foundations of a new province. Such systematic and overwhelming applications of engineering fundamentally altered the nature of ancient warfare. The focus shifted from the fleeting courage of a battlefield charge to the long-term planning, logistical mastery, and technical skill required to dismantle a fortress. These developments reveal how deeply Roman expansion was tied not just to military valor, but to a profound understanding of process and material science. The clash of arms has faded, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sounds of construction in a newly conquered land. Imagine a wild expanse in northern Hispania, where dense forests give way to rocky hills, and winding streams carve unpredictable paths through the earth. Control here is not won by a single battle, but by the ability to move men and supplies faster than any local uprising can gather. This monumental task does not begin with a general, but with a lone military surveyor, an engineer, who drives a wooden staff into the soil. Atop this staff sits a curious device, a cross-shaped instrument with weights hanging from each arm, called a groma. For the Romans, the first step in taming a wilderness was to impose upon it the most unnatural of things, a perfectly straight line. From this simple starting point, the process of dominion unfolded with relentless precision. The surveyor would sight along the weighted strings of his groma, aligning them with a distant marker, perhaps a brightly colored flag or the smoke from a signal fire tended by a soldier miles away. His assistants would then drive stakes into the ground, marking a path that defied the natural contours of the landscape. This line, arrow straight, cut across hills and aimed directly through forests, a declaration in wood and earth that Roman will was stronger than any obstacle. Local tribes, accustomed to paths that followed the gentle guidance of rivers and valleys, could only watch as this unswerving corridor was marked out, a feature so direct and purposeful it must have seemed the work of gods or madmen. Once the path was set, the true labor began, and the legionary traded his sword for a shovel. Organized into efficient crews, the soldiers descended upon the marked line. Their discipline, honed in battle, was now applied to a different kind of warfare, a war against the land itself. Centurions, acting as foremen, directed the excavation, their voices cutting through the sounds of digging and the grating of stone.
Men worked in shifts, their movements becoming slower and more deliberate as the day wore on. They paused often to pass around water skins, wiping sweat from their brows with dusty forearms. The ground itself fought back. They heaved heavy boulders from the soil and chopped through thick, stubborn tree roots, transforming a simple line of stakes into a deep, wide trench, the future bed of the empire's artery. This foundation was then filled with an intelligence born of centuries of engineering experience. The first layer, known as the statumen, consisted of large flat stones wedged together to create a stable, solid base that would not shift over time. On top of this, workers shoveled the rudis, a thick layer of smaller stones, broken tiles, and rubble, often mixed with sand. These materials were not chosen at random. The layers were designed for drainage, ensuring that rainwater would filter down and away rather than pooling and turning the road into mud. Quarries were established nearby, and the rhythmic clinking of hammers on chisels provided a constant soundtrack as teams of legionaries and local laborers shaped the necessary stone, while others managed the heavy carts that transported it to the construction site. Above these rougher layers came the finer work that distinguished a Roman road. A bedding of gravel and coarse sand, called the nucleus, was spread and compacted until it was almost as hard as modern concrete. In regions rich with volcanic ash, like much of Italy, engineers would mix this material, known as pozzolana, with lime to create a durable, water-resistant mortar that bound the nucleus together. Finally, the paving crew laid the summa crusta, the wearing surface. These were large, multi-sided stones fitted together like pieces of a puzzle with such precision that a knife blade could scarcely fit between them. The surface was given a slight crown or curve, so that water would run off into the drainage ditches that flanked the road, keeping the thoroughfare clear and usable in nearly all weather. This methodical approach was the standard, but Roman engineers were masters of adaptation. In the marshy lowlands of Britannia, where a stone foundation would simply sink into the wet ground, they drove thousands of timber piles deep into the earth to create a stable base, building a wooden causeway. In the soaring passes of the Alps, they did not go around mountains, they went through them, cutting ledges directly into the face of cliffs, creating roads that clung precariously to the rock. Conversely, in the flat, dry deserts of North Africa, the process was simpler. There, the road was often a cleared and leveled track, marked at regular intervals by milestones that guided caravans and military patrols from one well to the next, a lifeline drawn across the sand. The workforce itself reflected the empire's structure. While disciplined legionaries formed the core of these construction gangs, keeping them fit and occupied between campaigns, they were not alone. Auxiliary soldiers recruited from the provinces worked alongside them, earning their place in the Roman system through shared labor. In addition, local peoples were often conscripted for the immense task of clearing forests and hauling stone. This organization of labor was a model of efficiency, integrating diverse groups into a single, massive project under Roman command. It was a practical lesson in the power of the empire. Resistance was futile, but contributing to its projects offered a place, however humble, within its ordered world. With the completion of a road, the landscape was forever changed. A legion
which might have taken a week to march 50 miles through difficult terrain, could now cover that same distance in less than 2 days. This speed was the ultimate tool of control. But the roads served more than the military. They were the framework for the cursus publicus, the state-run postal and transport service. Relays of horsemen could carry official messages from a provincial governor to Rome at astonishing speeds, meaning the emperor's commands could reach the furthest frontiers in weeks instead of months. This network of information was as vital to holding the empire together as the soldiers who marched upon its paved surfaces. Inevitably, the initial military purpose of these roads was overtaken by their immense economic and cultural influence. Where the legions marched, merchants soon followed. Heavy wagons once bogged down in mud now rolled smoothly along the stone surfaces, carrying grain, wine, pottery, and textiles to new markets. Small inns and trading posts sprang up at crossroads and river fords, growing over time into bustling towns. The roads became channels not just for goods, but for ideas, language, and customs. A traveler could journey from the edge of Scotland to the mouth of the Nile, and for much of the way, the road beneath their feet was a constant, reassuring reminder of the single power that governed the known world. This brings us to a question that continues to be considered by historians. Were these roads built primarily for conquest or for commerce? The evidence suggests they were born of military necessity, designed to move troops with unmatched speed and efficiency. Yet, their most enduring legacy was economic and cultural. The military impetus created an infrastructure so powerful and permanent that it outlived the legions themselves, becoming the very veins of a new, interconnected world. This careful investigation into the construction of these arteries illuminates how the deliberate engineering of a landscape could fundamentally alter the character and destiny of its people.
The last standards of the legion have long since marched onward, their rhythmic tread now a fading memory on the horizon. In their place, a different kind of order begins to take root. The sounds of the provincial town have changed. The sharp commands of centurions and the clang of steel have given way to the haggling of merchants in the marketplace and the low murmur of conversation in a dozen local dialects. Yet, beneath this surface of returning normalcy, a deep uncertainty remains. A new figure has arrived, not in armor, but in a simple toga with a purple stripe signifying his authority. He is the provincial governor sent from Rome, and his tools are not the sword and shield, but the scroll, the stylus, and the weight of the law. His arrival is quiet, yet it signals a transformation more profound and lasting than any battle. The governor's first public act takes place not on a battlefield, but in the newly cleared space that will one day be the forum. He does not brandish a weapon, but instead unrolls a heavy papyrus scroll, its edges weighted with carved wooden rods. This is his edict, the formal declaration of the legal principles that will guide his administration. His voice is steady as a reader translates his Latin into the local tongue, announcing the days when he will personally hear legal cases and disputes. The process he outlines is a careful balance.
For conflicts between Roman citizens or between a citizen and a provincial, the unyielding logic of Roman law will apply. However, for disputes purely between locals, their ancestral customs will be honored, provided they do not offend Roman decency. This technical process of establishing legal jurisdiction is the first crucial step in weaving Roman authority into the very fabric of daily life, offering a predictable system where before might have been only the arbitrary will of a chieftain. This immense task cannot be accomplished alone. The governor's official staff is remarkably small, consisting of a few key figures who embody the administrative hierarchy. At his side stands the legatus, a man of senatorial rank who serves as his deputy and legal advisor. Responsible for the province's finances is the quaestor, a younger magistrate from Rome, his hands already full with the monumental task of assessing the region's economic output. This tiny cadre of officials understands that they cannot rule by force alone. They are too few, and the province is too vast. Their strategy, therefore, becomes one of cooperation and delegation. They must find a way to work with the existing social organization, identifying the local leaders who held power long before the legions arrived, and making them partners in the new order. To this end, the governor summons the council of local elders to his temporary residence. These are men of influence, wealthy landowners, and respected clan heads who watch the Roman with wary eyes. The meeting is a study in pragmatic diplomacy. The governor speaks not of conquest, but of opportunity. He details plans for a new aqueduct to bring fresh water to the town and a properly paved market to encourage trade. He offers these men positions on a new city council, giving them official Roman titles and a vested interest in the success of the province. This is the core of Rome's system of indirect rule, to find the natural leaders of a conquered society and bind their prosperity and prestige to that of the empire. For the elders, a difficult choice presents itself: to accept a diminished but secure authority under Rome, or to resist and risk losing everything. Once this tentative alliance is formed, the most sensitive and essential work begins: the census. The governor's quaestor dispatches teams of scribes who move methodically through the town and surrounding countryside. This is far more than a simple head count. The technical process involves a detailed inventory of wealth. Every plot of land is measured, its quality assessed for growing grapes, olives, or grain. Families are required to declare the number of their livestock, the output of their workshops, the value of their property. Each piece of information is meticulously recorded by a stylus on a hinged set of wax tablets. This activity, while peaceful, is deeply intrusive. It translates a community's entire existence into cold figures on a ledger, establishing a baseline for the one thing the empire requires above all else: taxes. From the numbers gathered by the census, the provincial tax liability is calculated. However, the Roman state did not possess a large bureaucracy for the collection itself. Instead, it relied on a system that was both highly efficient and fraught with problems: the publicani. These were private corporations, syndicates of wealthy businessmen in Rome who would bid for the contract to collect taxes in a given province.
They paid the state a guaranteed lump sum in advance, and were then permitted to collect the taxes themselves. Any amount they collected above the sum paid to the treasury was their profit. This arrangement insulated the Roman state from the risk of a shortfall, but it created a powerful incentive for the publicani to engage in ruthless and often predatory collection practices, a reality that became one of the greatest sources of provincial resentment. This system of administration had to contend with the immense diversity of the lands Rome now controlled. As the governor traveled his new domain, he would witness this complexity firsthand. In one valley, a shrine to a local god of the forest stood in a quiet grove. In another, the people spoke a dialect barely understood in the main town. The Roman solution to this challenge was not to impose a rigid uniformity. Instead, they practiced a form of pragmatic cultural absorption. A local deity might be given a Roman name. Its characteristics merged with a familiar god from the Roman pantheon. Local religious practices were allowed to continue undisturbed, with one crucial condition: that all subjects show respect for the genius of the emperor, often through a simple public offering of incense. This allowed diverse populations to maintain their identities while being folded into a single overarching imperial framework. The labor that held this entire structure together was not that of soldiers or builders, but of clerks, scribes, and messengers. The governor's office became the nerve center of the province, a place of quiet, relentless activity. Scribes sat at long tables, their hands stained with ink as they copied official correspondence and legal rulings onto fresh rolls of papyrus. Heavily armed couriers of the cursus publicus, the imperial postal service, arrived regularly, bringing edicts from Rome and carrying the governor's detailed reports back to the emperor. Surveyors consulted maps, planning the routes of new roads that would further bind the province to the heart of the empire. It was an organization built not on brute force, but on the power of information, creating an administrative grid that was, in its own way, as strong as any fortress wall.
Over months and then years, the effects of this new order became visible. A farmer whose land was being encroached upon by a powerful neighbor no longer had to rely on a feud or the favor of a local strongman. He could now travel to the provincial capital and petition the governor's court, confident that his case would be heard according to a written set of rules. Merchants began to use Roman-style contracts, their terms enforceable by the state, which reduced the risks of trade over long distances. This predictability and security was the essence of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was a peace imposed by a conqueror, but it provided a stability that often allowed for unprecedented levels of prosperity and interaction between formerly hostile peoples. Historical accounts from the period reveal the complex and often contradictory nature of this system. For a provincial aristocrat, granted Roman citizenship and a seat on the city council, Roman rule could be seen as an enlightened force, bringing law, order, and civilization. From his perspective, the empire was a meritocracy that rewarded cooperation. Yet for a peasant farmer whose olive crop failed, facing the unforgiving demands of the tax collector, the governor's administration was a machine of extraction, designed to drain the wealth of the provinces for the benefit of a distant city.
Both views contain a portion of the truth, and the reality of Roman governance existed in the wide and often difficult space between these two extremes. From a hill overlooking the provincial capital, the governor could see the physical manifestation of his work. The straight line of a new road cut across the landscape, aimed directly at the next major settlement. In the town, the foundations for a new stone courthouse were being laid near the bustling market. The legions had won the territory, but it was this slow, methodical imposition of systems, of law, of taxation, of bureaucracy that was truly conquering it. This administrative framework, invisible yet everywhere, was what transformed a collection of disparate tribes and towns into a lasting part of a world empire. The intricate weaving of Roman law and administration into the life of a province demonstrates how a state can use systems of order to govern peoples and reshape societies on a scale previously unimagined. After the governor's scroll established order, the empire's true engine began to turn. An engine that did not run on laws or legions, but on the raw materials of the earth. The focus of power shifted from the administrator's forum to the frontiers of production, to the places where the wealth that paid for the roads and funded the armies was torn from the ground. In the rugged mountains of northwestern Hispania, the air was thin, and the landscape was a harsh arrangement of stone and scrub. Here, workers shielded their eyes not from dust, but from the sharp glare of sunlight on exposed rock faces. The rhythmic tapping of countless iron picks against stone was the only consistent sound, a constant reminder of the difficult work of finding the veins of gold hidden within the mountainside. This relentless search for precious metals led to one of the most ambitious engineering methods of the ancient world. The process was known as ruina montium, or the wrecking of the mountains, and it was a display of overwhelming force against nature itself. First, skilled miners would spend months, sometimes years, carving a complex network of narrow tunnels deep into a mountainside, following the gold-bearing seams. At the same time, other teams of laborers constructed aqueducts, sometimes miles long, to channel water from rivers and streams into large reservoirs built high above the targeted mountain. This work required immense patience and a deep understanding of geology and water pressure. The men in the tunnels worked by the faint, flickering light of oil lamps, their movements cramped and their breathing shallow in the close confines. When all was ready, the spectacle was both terrifying and magnificent. The reservoir sluices were opened, and a massive volume of water plunged into the network of tunnels. The trapped air within the passages became highly compressed by the rushing water, until the pressure grew too great for the rock to contain. With a deep, earth-shaking rumble, the entire face of the mountain would explode outwards, collapsing into a torrent of water, rock, and earth. The resulting slurry was then carefully channeled through sluice boxes lined with coarse vegetation, which trapped the heavy flakes of gold. This method was brutally effective, capable of extracting more gold in a day than traditional mining could in months. But it left behind a scarred and broken landscape, a permanent testament to the empire's insatiable appetite for wealth. This hard-won metal, however, could not be eaten. While gold and silver filled the state's treasury and allowed for the minting of standardized coins that simplified trade across provinces, the empire's most critical resource was far more humble. In the fertile lands of Egypt, a different kind of wealth was harvested. Here, the landscape was not one of broken mountains, but of vast, flat plains of dark earth, divided by irrigation canals that glistened under the African sky. For centuries, the annual flooding of the Nile River had deposited rich silt, creating some of the most productive farmland in the world. Rome recognized this immediately upon conquering the region, and Egypt was transformed into the personal breadbasket of the emperor. The system of production was organized on an immense scale. Vast agricultural estates, known as latifundia, were managed with ruthless efficiency. Thousands of laborers, a mix of enslaved people and local tenant farmers, worked the fields. Their tasks followed the steady rhythm of the seasons, from plowing with oxen to sowing the seed, and finally to the harvest, where they moved in long lines, cutting the stalks of wheat with iron sickles. The sheer amount of grain produced was staggering. Overseers on horseback moved along the edges of the fields, ensuring the pace of work never slowed. The harvested wheat was threshed, winnowed to separate grain from chaff, and then transported to massive state-controlled granaries built along the Nile. These structures were marvels of practical engineering, with raised floors to keep the grain dry and ventilated, protecting the vital food supply from rot and pests. Getting this grain from the fields of Egypt to the mouths of the citizens in Rome was one of the greatest logistical challenges of the age. The solution was the annona, the state-supervised grain supply. The process began at the granaries, where the wheat was packed into sacks and loaded onto barges that navigated the Nile to the port of Alexandria. There, it was transferred to the holds of large, purpose-built cargo ships, some capable of carrying over 1,000 tons of grain. These ships were the workhorses of the Mediterranean, slow and broad-beamed, designed for capacity, not speed. A massive fleet, numbering in the hundreds, made the journey each year, timed to take advantage of the favorable summer sailing winds. The journey itself was perilous. The open sea was always unpredictable, and though the Roman navy had largely cleared the waters of organized pirate fleets, opportunistic raiders remained a constant threat. Consequently, the grain fleets often sailed in convoys, sometimes with naval escorts. The safe arrival of these ships at Ostia, the port of Rome, was a matter of state security. A delay or a loss of ships to a storm could lead to food shortages in the capital, which in turn could lead to riots and political instability. The entire system, from the farmer in Egypt to the sailor on the sea to the baker in Rome, was a complex chain, and a break in any link could have serious consequences. This reliance on imported food fundamentally changed the nature of the city of Rome, making its survival dependent on the labor and resources of a distant province. The vast economic machine required more than just gold and grain. From the quarries of Greece and North Africa became marble to build the temples and public buildings that were the physical symbols of Roman power. From salt pans along the coast came the salt needed to preserve food for the legions on the frontiers. The standardization of the silver denarius and the gold aureus created a common currency that allowed a merchant in Britain to trade easily with a supplier in Syria. Historical accounts indicate that this economic integration created a vast, interconnected market. Yet this prosperity was not evenly distributed. For every wealthy merchant, there were thousands of enslaved workers in the mines or tenant farmers bound by debt to the land they worked. This reality has led to a long-running discussion among historians. Was Roman expansion primarily driven by political ambition, a desire for glory, and a need to secure its borders against perceived threats? Or was it, at its core, an economic enterprise? Some argue that the desire for resources, for the slaves captured in war, the fertile land of conquered territories, and the precious metals needed to pay the soldiers, was the primary engine of the empire's growth. According to this view, the legions were not just defenders of the state, but the sharp edge of a system designed for resource extraction. Others maintain that while economic benefits were a welcome result of conquest, the initial motivations were more complex, rooted in political competition among Rome's elite. Regardless of the initial motive, the outcome was the same: the creation of a system that systematically moved wealth from the provinces to the center. The engineering of the mines, the organization of the great estates, and the logistics of the grain fleet were all parts of this immense apparatus. The infrastructure of roads and ports built for the legions served just as effectively to transport goods. The peace imposed by Roman arms created a secure environment for trade to flourish. These interconnected systems of military control, engineering, and labor organization reveal how deeply the pursuit of resources shaped the empire's development, answering some persistent questions about the true costs and benefits of its long existence. The legions have passed, their work of conquest complete. The sound of marching feet gives way to the ring of the mason's hammer and the surveyor's quiet calculations. In a provincial city like Lugdunum in Gaul, nestled where two rivers meet, a new kind of expansion is underway, one that happens not with the sword, but with the stonemason's chisel, the teacher's chalk, and the merchant's ledger. Here, the raw power of the empire settles into a permanent form, changing the very way people live, think, and see the world. The conquest of territory was only the first step. The conquest of the mind and heart was a far more complex and lasting endeavor. This transformation often began with the ground itself. When the Romans founded a new city, a colonia, for retired veterans or to act as an administrative center, they did not allow it to grow haphazardly. Instead, they imposed a deliberate, logical order on the land. Surveyors would arrive and use a simple but effective tool called a groma to lay out a perfect grid of streets, intersecting at right angles. This process created a city plan that was instantly recognizable, from Britain to Syria. At the heart of this grid, a space was always reserved for the forum, an open public square that served as the city's political and commercial center.
Around it would rise the basilica, a grand hall for law courts and business, and temples dedicated to the Roman gods, a physical manifestation of the new power. The construction of these public spaces was a statement. Local materials, like the pale limestone of Gaul or the dark volcanic rock of North Africa, were used for the heavy work. These materials of culture were shaped by Roman hands and Roman designs. Immense quantities of timber were felled for scaffolding and roofing, while for more important structures might be shipped from distant quarries. Roman engineers also brought their unique concrete, a mixture of lime, sand, and volcanic ash called pozzolana, which allowed them to build large, vaulted structures like public baths and amphitheaters that would have been impossible with traditional stone alone. These buildings were not just functional, they were advertisements for a new way of life, offering comforts and spectacles that drew people in from the surrounding countryside. The agents of this cultural change were many. Roman soldiers and veterans who settled in the provinces were the most direct carriers of this new identity. They brought their language, their customs, and their loyalty to the state. Merchants and traders, following the safety of the new roads, also played a crucial role. They created networks that moved not just goods, but ideas and fashions. A trader from Italy might bring a shipment of fine red gloss pottery known as Samian ware. Soon, local potters would begin to imitate the style, and within a generation, households across the province would be eating from dishes that looked just like those used in Rome itself, a small but significant link to the wider imperial world. Perhaps the most powerful tool of assimilation was the Roman legal system. In a world often governed by the shifting customs of local tribes, Roman law offered something remarkably different, a written, predictable set of rules. For a provincial merchant, the ability to sign a contract that would be enforced in the same way in Ephesus as it was in Hispania was a powerful advantage. A dispute over land ownership would be settled not by a show of force, but by a magistrate in the basilica, weighing evidence and delivering a judgment based on established statutes. This system offered a sense of security and fairness that, over time, many provincial peoples found deeply attractive, encouraging them to participate in the Roman legal process and, by extension, the Roman world. Of course, embracing this new world required a common language. Latin became the language of law, administration, and the military. For a local aristocrat in Gaul or Iberia, the path to influence and power for his children lay through a Roman education. Schools were established where the sons of local elites would learn to read, write, and speak Latin. They would study the works of Roman authors like Virgil and Cicero, absorbing not just a language, but a whole set of cultural values and historical narratives. These young men, fluent in Latin and versed in Roman ways, were the ideal candidates for positions on local town councils, becoming the crucial link between the provincial population and the Roman governors. This created a complex social dynamic. The local elites found themselves in a position of choice. They could resist the new order and risk losing their status, or they could adopt Roman customs to secure and even enhance their family's position. Many chose the latter.
They would build Roman-style courtyard houses or villas in the countryside, complete with mosaic floors and heated baths. They might take Roman names, wear the toga on formal occasions, and fund the construction of a new aqueduct or theater for their city, an act of public generosity known as eugurtism. In doing so, they became more Roman than the Romans themselves, powerful advocates for the very system that had conquered their ancestors. The result of these processes was not a simple replacement of one culture with another. Instead, a unique blend often emerged. In the provinces of Gaul, local deities were often paired with Roman ones. A temple might be dedicated to Apollo Granus, combining the Roman god of healing with a local Celtic deity. This blending, or syncretism, allowed people to participate in the Roman world without completely abandoning their ancestral traditions. It created distinct Gallo-Roman, Greco-Roman, or Romano-British identities, rich with local character, yet firmly connected to the larger imperial framework.
The ultimate prize for those who embraced this new identity was the prospect of Roman citizenship. Initially, this was a status reserved for the people of Rome and parts of Italy. However, as the empire expanded, citizenship was gradually extended as a reward for military service or for loyal service in local government. Citizenship came with significant legal and financial benefits, including the right to appeal to the emperor in a legal case. For generations, this prize served as a powerful incentive for provincials to assimilate, to prove their loyalty and their Romanness. The process culminated in the year 212 CE, when the Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, recognizing a reality that had been developing for centuries, that the empire was no longer just an Italian possession, but a shared community of peoples. This creation of a shared identity was arguably the empire's greatest and most enduring success. It was the cultural glue that held the vast and diverse territories together long after the initial conquests were forgotten. The physical infrastructure of roads and aqueducts was essential, but it was the invisible infrastructure of a shared language, a common legal framework, and a mutual cultural understanding that truly bound the empire into a single functioning whole for centuries. This legacy of law, language, and civic architecture would profoundly shape the future development of Europe and the Mediterranean world. Some historical accounts view this process, which is often called Romanization, as a voluntary and beneficial adoption of a superior culture. They point to the peace and prosperity that followed, the construction of magnificent cities, and the creation of a common legal ground. Other perspectives, however, question the voluntary nature of this change. They argue that it was a form of cultural pressure, where local identities were suppressed, and the only path to success required abandoning one's own heritage. The evidence suggests a complex reality somewhere in between, a mixture of eager adoption, pragmatic choice, and subtle resistance. This intricate process of cultural blending and assimilation remains a subject of great interest. The spread of an idea, after all, can be far more powerful than the advance of an army. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the subtle ways in which provincial peoples negotiated their place within the empire, showing how they adopted, adapted, and sometimes resisted Roman ways. Modern scholarship continues to explore the complex dynamics of these cultural interactions, offering an ever clearer picture of how a vast collection of conquered lands was transformed into a lasting and influential civilization. The great conquests had, for a time, slowed. Along the misty forests of Germania and the sun-scorched deserts bordering Parthia, the empire had found its edges. Here, the challenge was no longer about winning a single decisive battle, but about enduring, day after day, year after year. For the legionary standing watch on a northern wall, feeling the persistent dampness seep into his woolen cloak and leather sandals, victory was not a trumpet blast, but the reliable arrival of the daily grain ration. Sustaining these permanent armies in such harsh and distant lands was a logistical puzzle of immense proportions, one that required an entirely different kind of Roman genius. This was not the genius of the general, but that of the quartermaster, the engineer, and the clerk. The entire system began with a simple yet profound act of calculation. An administrator, far from the frontier, would dip his pen and work through the numbers. Each soldier required a daily portion of food, primarily grain, which was the fuel for the Roman military machine. Beyond this, he needed salt for preservation, sour wine for drinking, and oil. These individual needs, when multiplied by the 5,000 men of a single legion, and then by the dozens of legions stationed across the frontiers, became a staggering figure. This calculation formed the basis of the annona militaris, the military supply system. This system was not a matter of chance. It was a standardized process. From these calculations, orders flowed to the grain-rich provinces of Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, setting in motion the vast machinery of transport that fed the borders. To handle this constant flow of food, Roman engineers developed specialized structures. In the damp climate of Britain, for instance, a standard granary was a masterpiece of practical design. It was a long, stone building, but its most important feature was hidden. The floor was raised on short pillars of stone or wood, creating a space underneath for air to circulate. This simple feature was crucial, as it kept the stored grain free from the ground's moisture and discouraged pests. Small vents near the roof allowed air to move constantly, preventing the buildup of heat and rot. Consequently, a single fort could store enough grain to withstand a prolonged siege or a disruption in the supply lines, a testament to the Roman understanding that an army's strength was measured as much by its granaries as by its swords. This system of supply, however, had to adapt to wildly different environments. While legions on the Rhine and in Britain relied heavily on barges moving slowly up rivers and specially constructed canals, their counterparts in the East faced a completely different set of problems. In the arid landscapes of Syria and Judea, water was more precious than wine. Here, the supply lines depended on long trains of camels, creatures perfectly suited to the terrain. Forts were built not on rivers, but near deep wells, and engineers became experts at finding and managing water sources. The challenges of preservation also varied.
The persistent damp of the north caused leather to rot and iron to rust, requiring a steady supply of replacement equipment. In the south, the intense dryness could crack wooden spear shafts and shields, while the heat could spoil food quickly if not heavily salted. Each frontier demanded its own set of solutions. Maintaining this flow of goods over hundreds of miles presented the greatest challenge. A single wagon train, laden with grain and pulled by oxen, moved at a walking pace, making it a tempting target for raids. The Roman solution to this vulnerability was redundancy and organization. The network of paved roads, which we have seen before, was the primary artery. But it was not the only one. Where possible, goods were moved by water, which was far cheaper and could carry much greater bulk. Therefore, a legion in Germania might receive its grain by ship to the mouth of the Rhine, then by river barge inland, and only for the final few miles would the supplies be loaded onto wagons. If a road was blocked by a landslide or an enemy force, supplies could be rerouted along a river. If a local harvest failed, grain could be shipped from an entirely different part of the empire. This intricate, overlapping system created a resilience that was the key to maintaining a permanent military presence.
We know about these daily needs with remarkable clarity, not just from official histories, but from the personal writings of the soldiers themselves. At the fort of Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, the damp, oxygen-poor soil preserved thousands of small, thin wooden tablets. These were the letters and administrative documents of the garrison. They reveal the inner workings of the supply system in stunning detail. One tablet is a strength report for the garrison, listing how many soldiers are present, sick, or assigned elsewhere. Another is a simple request from one soldier to another, asking for the delivery of more socks, a constant necessity in the cold, wet climate. These small personal documents transform the grand logistical system into a human story of men trying to stay warm, fed, and equipped at the very edge of their known world. This constant, demanding work of supply had a profound historical impact. The ability to sustain large professional armies on its borders for centuries allowed Rome to stabilize its frontiers. This stability created the conditions for the long peace known as the Pax Romana. Within these defended borders, trade could flourish, and cities could grow without the constant fear of invasion. The logistical mastery of the Roman state, though less dramatic than a cavalry charge, was a foundational component of its imperial power. It demonstrated that true, lasting control was not just about conquering territory, but about having the organizational capacity to hold and administer it indefinitely. An army, after all, does not just march on its feet, it marches on its stomach. In recent times, scholars have begun to appreciate the sheer scale of this achievement through new methods. Using computer models and quantitative analysis, they can now create detailed simulations of the Roman supply chain. By inputting data on the caloric needs of a soldier, the carrying capacity of a Roman wagon, the speed of an ox, and the tonnage of a cargo ship, they can begin to map the immense flow of goods across the empire. These models help to visualize the thousands of farmers, sailors, clerks, and laborers whose coordinated efforts were required to deliver a single loaf of bread to a soldier on the wall.
This modern approach gives us a clearer picture than ever before of the astonishing organizational power of the Roman state. The long supply line was more than a chain of wagons and barges. It was the empire's lifeline. It connected the producer in a peaceful inner province with the consumer, the soldier, standing guard on a distant and dangerous frontier. This connection required immense foresight, planning, and relentless daily effort. It was a system built not of grand pronouncements, but of careful accounting and practical engineering. It was a slow, steady pulse that beat throughout the empire, ensuring that the frontiers held, the peace was kept, and the idea of Rome could endure even in the most inhospitable of places. This intricate network was, in many ways, the quiet hero of the empire's long story. The legions were the visible shield, but the supply system was the beating heart that kept that shield strong. It allowed for the establishment of permanent borders, transforming temporary military camps into lasting fixtures of the landscape. And in doing so, it created the very framework within which the Roman peace could be built and maintained for generations. The detailed supply lists from Vindolocta and the standardized architecture of frontier granaries present a layered picture of daily life, military strategy, and state power. These pieces of evidence, from the mundane request for warm clothing to the sophisticated engineering of a food storage facility, reveal the true foundations of the empire's endurance, a subject that continues to provide new insights for those who study it. The landward soldier, the legionary, has long stood as the image of Roman power, his hobnailed sandals marching across continents. Yet, for much of the empire, the true connections were not forged in dust, but in salt water. The story of this dominion begins not in a fortress, but in a port, a place like Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber River. Here, the air carried the scent of wet rope, pine pitch used for sealing hulls, and the sharp tang of salt from drying fish. Men from every corner of the known world shouted in a dozen different languages, their voices a constant hum beneath the cries of gulls and the groan of wooden cranes lifting amphorae, clay jars filled with wine from Gaul or olive oil from Hispania. This was the empire's great receiving dock, the gateway through which its lifeblood flowed. This gateway, however, was not a gift of nature. The coastline near Rome offered no natural deep-water harbor, a severe limitation for a city of 1 million souls. The solution was a testament to engineering on a scale few had ever attempted. The process began with the construction of immense breakwaters, curving arms of stone and concrete reaching out into the sea to create a calm, protected basin. To build these, engineers directed the construction of huge wooden barges, which were then floated into position and filled with a remarkable Roman concrete mixed with volcanic ash. This material had the unique property of hardening underwater. As the barges sank under their immense weight, they formed the solid foundations for the moles, or seawalls, upon which towering lighthouses were later built to guide ships safely home through the night.
Inside this man-made sanctuary, a different kind of order prevailed, centered on the ships themselves. One might see a warship slip its mooring, a vessel like the Liburnian. This was not a large or imposing ship, but it was built for a purpose. Its hull was long and narrow, designed to cut through the water with minimal resistance, propelled by banks of oarsmen who were trained to row in perfect, powerful unison. In contrast, tied to the nearby docks were the great cargo ships, the backbone of the Annona, the grain supply that fed Rome. These were vessels of an entirely different philosophy, with deep, rounded bellies built not for speed, but for maximum capacity. They moved slowly under a single vast square sail, their progress dependent on the whims of the wind. Yet their steady arrival was the pulse of the city's survival. The men who crewed these vessels reflected the empire's diverse social fabric. While the legions were a path to citizenship for provincials, the navy was often seen as a lesser service. Many of the sailors and oarsmen were not citizens at all, but free subjects from the maritime provinces of Greece, Syria, and Egypt, men who had the sea in their blood. They lived a life of hard discipline under the command of a naval hierarchy that mirrored the army structure. These fleets were not scattered randomly, but were organized into powerful commands at key strategic points. The main fleets stationed at Misenum near the Bay of Naples and Ravenna on the Adriatic coast could project Roman power across the entire Mediterranean basin, acting as a constant and visible reminder of who controlled the waves. The primary role of these permanent fleets was not glorious battle, but the constant, grinding work of policing. For centuries before Rome's dominance, the Mediterranean had been a place of immense danger. Pirates, operating from hidden coves in places like Cilicia in modern-day Turkey, were a plague on trade. They saw any merchant vessel as a prize, its cargo to be stolen, its crew and passengers to be sold into slavery. This persistent threat made long-distance trade a gamble, raising the cost of all goods and keeping the economies of the Mediterranean world fragmented and defensive. To truly unify its territory, Rome had to solve this problem, not just for a season, but forever. This challenge was met with a campaign of breathtaking scale and organization, led by the general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to history as Pompey the Great. He was granted extraordinary power to confront the pirate menace. Rather than chasing individual pirate bands, he treated the entire Mediterranean as a single strategic theater. He began by dividing the sea into 13 distinct districts, assigning a commander and a squadron of ships to each one. This approach created a comprehensive net. Historical accounts describe how his forces started in the west, systematically sweeping eastward, driving the pirates from their havens, and preventing them from fleeing to other regions. It was a methodical application of overwhelming force, a naval strategy built on logistics and coordination rather than single dramatic encounters. The pirates, unable to escape the closing net, were eventually cornered. The final confrontations were less battles and more the conclusion of a relentless pursuit. By clearing the seas in a single sustained campaign, Pompey did more than win a military victory.
He fundamentally changed the economic and psychological landscape of the ancient world. The solution was then made permanent. The establishment of the major naval bases at Misenum and Ravenna was the long-term institutional answer to the initial problem. From these ports, regular anti-piracy patrols could be dispatched, ensuring that the threat, once extinguished, would not be allowed to reignite. This security was the essential foundation upon which the prosperity of the early empire was built.
The historical impact of this maritime control cannot be overstated. With the sea transformed from a dangerous frontier into a secure Roman lake, what they proudly called Mare Nostrum, or our sea, the movement of goods, people, and ideas became faster, cheaper, and safer than ever before. A shipment of Egyptian grain could reach Rome with predictable regularity. Marble quarried in Greece could be transported to build temples in Gaul. A legion needing to respond to an uprising in Hispania could be embarked in Italy and arrive on the scene in a fraction of the time it would have taken to march overland. This naval supremacy was the invisible enabler of empire, the circulatory system that kept the vast and complex body politic nourished and connected. This control of the sea also made possible military endeavors that would have otherwise been unthinkable. The invasion of Britain under the Emperor Claudius serves as a clear example. Transporting tens of thousands of soldiers, along with their equipment, siege engines, and months of supplies across the notoriously rough waters of the English Channel was a logistical feat of the highest order. It was only possible because the Roman navy had complete and unchallenged supremacy. There was no enemy fleet to intercept the transports, no maritime threat to disrupt the crucial supply lines that would sustain the army in a new and hostile land. The Navy, in this role, acted as the bridge that allowed the land-based power of the legions to be projected across the water. Now, one might wonder why the Roman Navy is so often overshadowed in popular memory by the legions. The legionary fought in dramatic, set-piece battles that were recorded in vivid detail by historians. The clash of armies, the tales of heroism, the decisive charges, these made for compelling accounts. By contrast, the Navy's greatest successes after the Civil Wars were often the absence of conflict. Its power was demonstrated by the merchant ships that sailed unmolested, the grain that arrived on time, and the pirates who were no longer a threat. It was a victory won through presence, patrol, and prevention, a constant and quiet labor that was fundamental to the functioning of the entire imperial system. This quiet work required a vast industrial and logistical effort. The great naval bases were not just anchorages, they were massive industrial complexes. They contained workshops for sailmakers, rope walks for twisting miles of cordage from hemp and papyrus, and forges where smiths hammered out anchors, nails, and fittings. Vast warehouses stored preserved food, fresh water, and spare parts. The labor force included not just sailors and marines, but also carpenters, sailmakers, and clerks who kept meticulous records of supplies. This organization demonstrates that the Romans understood sea power not merely as a collection of warships, but as a complex system requiring sustained industrial support and sophisticated administration to be effective.
In the end, the empire's control of the Mediterranean was far more than a military achievement. It was an act of environmental transformation. A body of water that had once been a barrier that divided cultures, a wilderness where lawless bands preyed on the weak, was reshaped by Roman will into a connector, a highway, a zone of peace. This maritime order allowed for an unprecedented level of economic and cultural integration, binding the coastal lands of Europe, Africa, and Asia into a single cohesive world. The sea became the empire's shared public square. This profound reorganization of the maritime world reflects a society's response to the immense pressures of governing a diverse and sprawling territory. The need for food, for resources, for rapid military deployment, and for secure communication all demanded a mastery of the waters that connected the empire's disparate parts. The Roman achievement was to see the sea not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity, and to build the complex machinery of ships, harbors, and organizations necessary to realize that vision. Their success laid the foundation for a peace that would last for generations. The final horn blows, its long, low note echoing off the stone walls of the fortress. For 25 years, that sound has meant a change of the watch, a call to arms, or the close of a day's hard labor. Today, for Lucius Valerius, it means the end of a life. In his hand, he holds not a sword or a shield, but a small wooden tablet, a diploma, granting him his citizenship, a plot of land, and his freedom. After a quarter century of service on the Rhine frontier, the organized world of the legion is behind him. He stands at the gate of the castra, the military camp, and looks out at the sprawling, chaotic settlement that has grown just beyond its walls. The familiar discipline is inside. A new, uncertain world is out there. A part of him felt the pull of Italia, a place he had not seen since he was a boy, a land of memory filled with warm sun and the taste of his mother's bread. Yet that world was now a stranger's tale. His world was here, on the edge of the empire, a place of damp earth, tall forests, and the sharp cries of unfamiliar birds. The settlement outside the fort, the Canabe, was a noisy, bustling place filled with merchants, craftsmen, and the families of soldiers, all drawn to the legion as a source of security and commerce. He found himself torn between the imagined comforts of a forgotten home and the tangible reality of a community he had helped protect. He chose the frontier. It was a choice made not with soaring ambition, but with the quiet logic of a man who plants his feet on the ground he knows. His reward was not just a bonus of silver coins, but a parcel of land, measured and allocated through a process of remarkable precision. He watched the military surveyors, the agrimensores, at work. They used a tool called a groma, a cross staff with plumb lines to lay out impossibly straight lines across the landscape, dividing the territory into a perfect grid of squares. This system, known as centuriation, imposed a distinctly Roman order on the wild land. Lucius's plot was one of many, a neat rectangle of earth waiting for a plow. It was the same logic that had built the camp: order, measure, and function. The process involved not just lines on a map, but the physical work of clearing trees and marking boundaries with stones, transforming a patch of forest into a farm that was, by its very shape, an extension of Roman thought. While his land was being formally marked, Lucius lived in the Canabe, the civilian town clinging to the fortress. Unlike the rigid, planned interior of the camp, this place had grown organically. Its streets were narrower, twisting around merchant stalls and workshops. Here, the strict military Latin of the legionaries mixed with the Gallic and Germanic tongues of the locals. The sounds were of hammers striking anvils, weavers' looms clacking, and children laughing in a dozen different dialects. It was in this vibrant, messy space that the true fusion of cultures began. Roman-style pottery was sold next to locally made leather goods, and retired soldiers like Lucius could be seen sharing a drink with tribal leaders, negotiating the price of grain or timber. Over the years, this relationship between the formal camp and the informal town began to change. The legion's presence became permanent, and the camp's original timber walls and barracks were slowly replaced with stone, a clear statement that Rome was here to stay. The grid layout of the castra, with its main streets, the Via Principalis and Via Praetoria, became the blueprint for a more permanent city. The Canaba was gradually absorbed into this new plan, its winding paths straightened and its wooden shacks replaced with stone and timber houses. Lucius, having built his own sturdy farmhouse, watched as a forum, a public square for markets and official business, was laid out where a muddy field had once been. The camp was becoming the heart of a city. As a veteran, Lucius held a position of respect. His discipline, learned over decades of service, made him a successful farmer. He married a local woman, the daughter of a tribal chief, who saw the advantage of an alliance with a Roman landowner. Their children grew up speaking Latin to their father and their mother's tongue to their grandparents, embodying the new blended identity of the frontier. Historical accounts indicate that this was a common and deliberate policy. Veterans were not just retired soldiers. They were social and economic anchors. They became farmers, business owners, and local magistrates, fiercely loyal to the system that had given them their start and deeply invested in the peace and stability of their new homes. One afternoon, visiting a stonemason to order a milestone for his property line, Lucius saw the artisan finishing a tombstone for a fellow veteran who had recently passed. The inscription was a powerful piece of evidence, a small history carved in stone. It listed the man's name, his legion, the Legio 22nd Primigenia, his rank as a standard-bearer, his years of service, and his place of origin in northern Italy. It ended with the simple phrase, "Hic situs est," meaning, "he is laid here." Around them, countless similar stones stood in the town's cemetery, each one a record of a life spent in service, creating a dense archaeological map of the men from all over the empire who had come to this frontier and made it their final home. This integration was not always a simple affair. Scholarly debate continues on whether the relationship between the military and civilian populations was one of peaceful cooperation or simmering tension. Evidence exists for both. Lucius once found himself mediating a dispute between a group of his fellow veterans and local farmers over access to a stream for irrigating their fields. The veterans, accustomed to the legion's unquestioned authority, saw the stream as theirs by right.
The locals, whose families had used it for generations, saw the Romans as overbearing newcomers. The resolution came not through force, but through negotiation in the new town council, where Lucius, respected by both sides, helped draft an agreement. This shows that Roman order was often maintained through careful compromise, not just command. This transformation from a military outpost to a thriving civilian center was not unique to Lucius's home. All across the empire, from Eboracum in Britain, which would one day be called York, to Vindobona on the Danube, the future Vienna, the same pattern unfolded. The forts established by the legions acted as seeds from which cities grew. These new urban centers projected Roman law, culture, and economic practices deep into the surrounding countryside. They became hubs of trade, administration, and, most importantly, loyalty to the empire, secured not by force of arms, but by the presence of thousands of veterans and their families who had a personal stake in its success. Years later, as an old man and an elected magistrate, Lucius stood in the forum of the town, now a fully chartered municipium with its own local government. He watched wagons loaded with grain from his farm and others roll towards the river docks, destined to feed the legions still guarding the frontier further north. Children ran past him, their Latin lessons finished for the day, on their way to the public bathhouse he had helped fund. The air no longer carried the constant tension of a military outpost, but the steady hum of civic life. The sharp edges of conquest had softened over a generation, replaced by the routines of commerce and community. The camp had been an instrument of power, a projection of military might designed to control territory. But it had become something more enduring, a cradle for a new kind of society. The grid of its streets, the stone of its walls, and the discipline of its former soldiers had all contributed to the creation of a lasting city, a Roman world built far from Rome itself. These patterns of settlement and civic development provide a clear record of how a military presence could evolve into a stable, integrated, and enduring foundation for provincial life. Let us take a final sweeping view, as if from a great height, looking down upon the world as it was. On a northern frontier, a sentry pulls his wool cloak tighter, the damp chill of the British mist seeping into the stone of the wall he guards. He watches the wild green land beyond, a place defined by its separation from the order behind him. Far to the south and east, another soldier stands watch over a desert caravan route in Syria. His linen tunic is damp with sweat, and he squints against the shimmering air rising from the sand, the cries of peacocks from a nearby oasis sounding strange and distant. Between these two men, a single complex system is at work, a vast and intricate machine of power and people, stretching from the cold sea to the hot sands. This concluding reflection is not about a single battle or one road, but about the whole immense creation and the enduring questions it left behind. This empire was not built on a single idea, but on a self-reinforcing cycle of interlocking processes. It began with military success, with the flexible blade of the manipular legion proving superior on the battlefields of Italy. Yet victory was only the first step.
Each conquest created a new problem of control, which was solved by the engineers. Legions that once fought became construction crews, paving the straight, durable roads that allowed them to move with unmatched speed. These roads, the veins of the empire, carried not just soldiers, but governors and their scrolls, bringing with them the unyielding logic of Roman administration. A census would be taken, land would be measured, and taxes would be levied, turning conquered territory into a productive asset. The process was systematic, logical, and relentless. From this administrative grip came the means to fuel the entire imperial machine. The wealth of the world, grain from the fertile fields of Egypt, silver from the deep mines of Hispania, flowed back towards the center. This extraction was not accidental. It was a highly organized undertaking, managed by complex logistics that could feed a city of 1 million people and supply armies thousands of miles from home. This constant flow of resources paid for the military, funded more public works, and enriched the elite, which in turn created more demand for expansion. Military success led to engineering, which enabled administration, which allowed for economic exploitation. This cycle, repeated over centuries, was the engine that built and sustained Roman power, a system where each part strengthened the others. However, the most lasting conquest was not one of territory or resources, but of minds and habits. Alongside the legions and tax collectors came a powerful idea of what it meant to be civilized. In a provincial town in Gaul, local leaders might debate civic matters in a newly built basilica, its architecture a direct copy of those in Rome. Their children might learn the verses of the poet Virgil in a local school, their native tongue slowly giving way to the precision of Latin. This was the process of Romanization, the spread of a culture that offered tangible benefits, law, order, citizenship, and opportunity to those who embraced it. It was a transformation that happened not always by force, but often through attraction, creating new blended identities like Gallo-Roman or Greco-Roman, where people could be fiercely loyal to their local customs and to the broader idea of the empire at the same time. This brings us to perhaps the most difficult aspect of this entire history. For every provincial who benefited from the peace and law of the Pax Romana, there was another whose life was diminished by it. One person's opportunity was often built on another's loss. The same legal system that protected a merchant's contract could be used to legally seize a farmer's ancestral land for a new veterans colony. The magnificent amphitheater where citizens enjoyed public spectacles was built with stone cut from quarries by the forced labor of captives. Historical accounts from the era describe both the pride of provincials who gained citizenship and the bitterness of those who resisted assimilation. Therefore, to see the empire as only a bringer of civilization is to ignore the immense human cost. To see it as only a machine of brutal extraction is to ignore the genuine peace and shared culture it created for millions. The truth, as it so often is, resides in the uncomfortable space between these two extremes. The sheer scale of the Roman achievement was made possible by an astonishing command over the material world. The systems of supply, which kept frontier armies fed and equipped in hostile environments, were triumphs of logistical planning. The construction of aqueducts,
harbors, and public buildings across 3 continents demonstrated an understanding of engineering and labor organization that would not be matched for another 1,000 years. The Roman navy, by clearing the seas of pirates and creating the Mare Nostrum, or Our Sea, forged a single economic and cultural zone around the Mediterranean. This maritime control was the silent partner to the legion's victories on land, ensuring that troops, goods, and ideas could move safely and reliably across the water. Each element, from the granaries on Hadrian's Wall to the lighthouses of Alexandria, was a piece of the same intricate puzzle. And when the soldiers' service was done, they too became instruments of imperial consolidation. The policy of settling veterans in colonies on the frontiers was a masterstroke of social engineering. These former legionaries, disciplined and loyal, brought Roman customs, language, and law with them, establishing stable communities that acted as anchors of Roman culture in newly conquered lands. Many of the great cities of modern Europe began this way, as the civilian towns that grew up around a permanent military camp. The veteran, having spent his youth defending the empire, spent his elder years building it, transforming the raw edge of the frontier into a reflection of the heartland. This process shows how the military was not just a tool for conquest, but also the primary agent for integration and cultural change. In the end, the story of Roman expansion is a profound exploration of human organization. It is a testament to what can be achieved through disciplined systems, ambitious engineering, and a pragmatic approach to governance. It raises timeless questions about the nature of power, the relationship between the center and the periphery, and the complex ways cultures interact. The roads, laws, languages, and cities they left behind became the foundation for much of what followed, shaping the world in ways that are still felt today. It was a legacy of both connection and coercion, of great creativity and sometimes great cruelty.
The physical and conceptual systems established during this era of growth continue to inform our understanding of how societies are built and maintained. The debates over its costs and benefits, its triumphs and its tragedies, are not merely historical exercises. They touch upon enduring themes of identity, power, and the shared human endeavor to create order out of chaos. The immense and lasting weight of Rome's story is a reminder that the past is never truly past. It is the landscape upon which the present is built. As we bring our journey through the expansion of the Roman Empire to a close for tonight, let the great narrative rest. The immense energy of imperial growth, with its marching legions and tireless engineers, eventually settled. Its purpose shifted from conquest to cultivation, from the forward march to the deep, settled peace. Imagine the profound quiet that fell after the road builders' hammers as the last great paving stone was set into the earth, creating a silent path to a distant province. Picture the soft, steady glow from an oil lamp in a countryside villa, its inhabitants secure within the stillness of the Pax Romana. All great endeavors, even those of an empire, must find their evening. Let that same sense of peaceful conclusion find you now. The maps of your day are folded away. and the roads of tomorrow are not yet traveled. Allow the quiet of history's long twilight to gently envelop you. Rest deeply and sleep peacefully.